Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're going to talk about something we all think we understand. A party, a festival, a good time. But we're going to drift back, way back, to a time when a party wasn't just about having fun. It was a fundamental part of the machinery of survival, a pressure valve for a world of incredible hardship, and a spectacle of such raw, earthy energy that it makes our modern get-togethers look, well, rather polite. We're going to explore the remarkable grit and ingenuity of medieval people, not in how they fought wars, but in how they celebrated life itself. As always, if you enjoy what I do here, if it helps you unwind, feel free to do all the usual things like subscribe. It really does help this little corner of the internet grow. And I love reading your comments, especially hearing where you're all listening from. It's incredible to think of us as a quiet, global community, all settling in for the night together. It really is. But that's enough of that. The main thing now is for you to get comfortable. Dim the lights. Adjust your pillow one last time. Maybe you have a fan on, for that soft, steady hum. Let your breathing slow down. There's nothing you need to do, nothing you need to figure out. Just let the story wash over you. Let's ease into our journey together. Chapter 1. The Rhythm of the Year. The Liturgical and Agrarian Calendars. Before we can even begin to talk about a medieval feast, with its roaring fires and questionable table manners, we have to talk about something far more fundamental. We have to talk about time itself, because in the medieval world, time didn't work the way it does for us. For us, time is a tyrant. It's a digital readout on a microwave, a series of appointments in a calendar app, a frantic linear race from one obligation to the next. We measure it, we manage it, we try to optimize it. We are constantly running out of it. It's a source of anxiety, a resource to be spent. For the medieval peasant, lord, or monk, time was something entirely different. It was a circle. It was a vast, repeating rhythm, like breathing. It wasn't something you managed. It was something you were simply in. It wasn't about the minute or the second. Clocks with minute hands were a fantastically rare and complex piece of technology for much of this period. Time was measured by the grand, slow turning of the heavens and the earth. The first and most immediate clock was the sun. Its arc across the sky didn't just tell you if it was morning or afternoon. It told you when to work, when to pray, when to eat, and when to huddle inside for safety. The day was bookended by light and a profound, almost total darkness we can barely imagine. The seasons weren't just a change in weather. They were the four great acts of an epic play that determined whether you would eat or starve. But this natural rhythm, the pulse of the planet itself, was overlaid with another, equally powerful system. Think of it as a piece of spiritual software running on the hardware of the seasons. This was the liturgical calendar, the calendar of the Church. And together, these two calendars, one written by God in the stars and the soil, the other written by the Church in Rome, created the inescapable operating system for every single life in medieval Europe. You couldn't opt out. There was no other app to download. This was the rhythm of reality. Let's start with the Church's version of time. The liturgical year wasn't a sterile grid of months and days like our desk calendars. It was a story, a living, breathing narrative of faith that the entire community relived, year after year. It began in the deepening gloom of late autumn, with Advent, a period of waiting, of quiet anticipation for the coming of Christ. It was a time of fasting, of turning inward, as the world outside grew colder and darker. The colours of the Church were purple and violet, sombre and penitent. The mood was hushed. The world was holding its breath. And then, just as the natural world reached its darkest point with the winter solstice, the calendar exploded into light and celebration. Christmas. The 12 days of Christmas weren't just a song. They were a genuine state-sanctioned holiday season. This was the first great feast of the year, a profound release from the gloom of Advent. We'll talk much more about what that feast actually looked like later, but for now, just imagine the psychological impact. After weeks of darkness and piety, suddenly there was light, fire, food, and a suspension of the normal rules. It was a reminder of hope in the dead of winter. After the glow of Christmas faded, the calendar settled into a long, cold stretch of what was called ordinary time, a rather bland name for a period that was anything but. This was the hard slog of winter. But even here, the calendar was punctuated with smaller festivals. little pinpricks of light in the darkness. There was Candlemas in early February, a festival of light where all the church's candles for the year were blessed. It was a beautiful flickering promise that the sun would, eventually, return. And then came the next great period of solemnity, Lent. 40 days of it. This wasn't the modern version of giving up chocolate for a few weeks. This was a serious, community-wide period of fasting and penance. Meat, eggs, dairy, all forbidden. The diet became thin, monotonous, and meagre. It was a long, grey, hungry march towards the climax of the Christian story. Life became quieter, more subdued. The vibrant colours were stripped from the church altar. It was a time meant to mirror Christ's 40 days in the desert, but it also conveniently coincided with the time of year when food stores from the last harvest were at their absolute lowest. The hunger was both spiritual and deeply gnawingly physical, a divine mandate that aligned perfectly with grim necessity. But if you endured Lent, if you made it through the long hunger, the reward was Easter. Easter was not the gentle, pastel-coloured holiday we know. It was a thunderous, exultant roar of celebration. It was the absolute pinnacle of the Christian year, even more significant than Christmas. It was the feast to end all feasts. The fasting was over. The prohibitions were lifted. Meat was back on the table. Life had triumphed over death, light over darkness, and for the common person, a full belly over an empty one. The release of tension, the sheer joy of it, is something we can barely comprehend. It was a party at the end of the world, a new beginning for everyone. The liturgical calendar then moved through the 50 days of Eastertide, leading to Pentecost or Whitsun, another major festival celebrating the arrival of the Holy Spirit. And then the year settled into the long green stretch of summer, another period of ordinary time, but this one filled with warmth, long days, and the promise of the coming harvest. Now, woven into this grand drama of sin and salvation were hundreds, and I mean hundreds of saints' days. Every day of the year was dedicated to at least one saint, often more. There was a saint for everything, a celestial specialist for any problem you might encounter. Saint Anthony helped you find lost things. Saint Apollonia was the one to pray to for a toothache. Saint Giles protected cripples and beggars. It was a vast invisible support network. Most of these saints' days were minor affairs, perhaps just a special prayer said at Mass, but some were hugely important local holidays. Your village's patron saint would have their day celebrated with a massive festival, a fair, and a day off work. This system created a patchwork of local holidays across Christendom. A peasant in Kent might have a day off for St. Augustine's feast, while a farmer in Burgundy was celebrating the day of St. Martin. It meant that while the major feasts were universal, the texture of the year, the specific rhythm of work and rest, could vary from one valley to the next. It was a system both grandly unified and intensely local. This calendar gave life a shape, a narrative arc. It provided a predictable cycle of fasting and feasting, of sorrow and joy. It told you not just what to believe, but how to feel. In the depths of a bleak, cold February, the promise of Easter was not an abstract theological concept. It was a tangible hope for warmth, light, and a decent meal. In the midst of back-breaking summer labour, the coming holy day was a beacon, a promise of rest and revelry. It gave meaning to suffering and a structure for joy. It was, in its own way, a deeply comforting system. You always knew where you were in the story. But this spiritual software, as we called it, was running on some very real, very unforgiving hardware. And that was the other calendar, the one dictated not by popes and bishops, but by mud, rain, and the sun. This was the agrarian calendar, the rhythm of the earth. For more than 90% of the population, this was the calendar that truly ruled their lives. If the church calendar was a story of salvation, the agrarian calendar was a story of survival, and it was a story with a recurring, terrifying villain, starvation. Every single year was a gamble against this foe, and the work was relentless. The agricultural year didn't begin neatly on January 1st. Its true beginning was arguably in the damp, chilly days of early spring, after the frost had finally released its grip on the soil. This was ploughing time, the new year's first great act of labour. Imagine the scene. The heavy wooden plough, perhaps tipped with a precious sliver of iron, pulled by a team of exhausted-looking oxen. The beasts, thin after a long winter on poor fodder, straining against the wet, heavy earth. Behind them the peasant, leaning all his weight into the plough handles, his boots sinking into the thick, cold mud. It was grueling, back-breaking work from sunrise to sunset. This moment was so crucial that it was sanctified by the church. The first Monday after the 12 days of Christmas was known as Plough Monday. On the Sunday before, the plough would often be brought into the church itself to be blessed. Holy water would be sprinkled on it. This wasn't just a quaint ritual. This was a desperate plea for divine intervention. It was an admission that human effort alone was not enough. They needed God's help to make the earth yield, to make the coming year a successful one. It was the perfect fusion of the two calendars, the most vital act of the agrarian year, given a sacred space within the liturgical one. Once the fields were ploughed, the sowing began. Another gamble, casting the precious seed, the very grain that was needed for bread now, into the ground, trusting that it would multiply. It was an act of faith, both religious and agricultural. Then came the harrowing, dragging branches over the fields to cover the seed, to protect it from the ever-watchful crows. As spring warmed into early summer, the work shifted. There was the constant, tedious, essential job of weeding. Every weed that grew was a thief, stealing sunlight and nutrients from the precious crop. This was often the work of women and children, crawling through the fields on their hands and knees, pulling up thistle and dock by hand until their fingers were raw. Then came haymaking. The meadows had to be cut with scythes to provide winter fodder for the animals. The scythe was a wickedly sharp, unforgiving tool. The work was rhythmic, communal, and exhausting, performed under the hot sun of early summer. You can almost feel the ache in the lower back, the sting of sweat in the eyes, the constant thirst. Once cut, the hay had to be turned, and turned again to dry before it could be gathered into haystacks. And all of this was a frantic race against the rain. A single downpour at the wrong moment could ruin the entire crop, and a ruined hay crop meant dead or weakened animals come winter. The stakes were always incredibly high, but the great climax of the agrarian year, its own version of Easter, was the harvest. This was it, the culmination of the entire year's effort. The grain harvest, wheat, rye, barley, oats, was the absolute linchpin of survival. For a few frantic weeks in late summer, every able-bodied person in the village, from the youngest child to the oldest grandparent, was in the fields. The men typically moved in a line with sickles or scythes, cutting the stalks of grain. Behind them, women and children followed, gathering the cut stalks into bundles called sheaves. The work was relentless. From the first hint of dawn until the last ray of light had faded from the sky, the sun beat down. The dust from the grain filled your nose and throat. The sharp stubble of the cut stalks scratched at your legs. Thirst was a constant companion. It was a period of immense communal effort, but also immense anxiety. Like haymaking, it was a race against time and weather. A week of rain could cause the grain to rot or sprout in the ear, rendering it useless. A hailstorm could flatten an entire field in minutes, wiping out a year's work and a year's food supply in a heartbeat. The pressure was immense, but if by the grace of God and their own sweat they brought the harvest in, the feeling of relief was profound. It's a feeling of security so fundamental that we, with our 24-hour supermarkets, can scarcely imagine it. It wasn't just grain in the barn, it was life. It was bread for the winter. It was survival for another year. And this moment too was sanctified. The festival of Lammas, on August 1st, comes from the Old English for loaf-mass. On this day, the first loaf of bread baked from the new harvest was brought to the church to be blessed. It was a sacrament of survival, a thanksgiving for the first fruits of the harvest. The end of the harvest season was marked by a huge celebration, the harvest home, a feast given by the Lord of the Manor for all his tenants. It was a raucous, joyous, and often drunken affair, a massive exhalation of collective relief. The great gamble had paid off. After the grain harvest, the work wasn't over. There was still the gathering of peas and beans, the picking of fruit in the orchards, the slaughtering of excess livestock before winter. Animals that couldn't be fed through the lean months were killed, and their meat salted or smoked, a grim but necessary task to ensure there was protein for the coming cold. And then, as autumn deepened, the cycle began again. The fields were ploughed one more time and sown with winter wheat, the hardy crop that would lie dormant under the snow, and hopefully provide an early yield the next year. And as the days grew shorter and the air colder, the agrarian calendar wound down, the land went to sleep. The work moved indoors, mending tools, spinning wool, surviving. This was the rhythm of the land, a cycle of intense, frantic labor, followed by periods of relative quiet. It was a calendar governed by complete and utter pragmatism. You did what the season demanded, when it demanded it. There was no procrastination. Putting off the ploughing or the harvest wasn't an option, unless you had a deep and abiding desire to see your family starve. So we have these two great wheels turning, constantly interacting, the liturgical calendar with its spiritual narrative, and the agrarian calendar with its narrative of physical survival. And they weren't in conflict. They were deeply, inextricably linked. The Church, in its profound wisdom, understood that to capture the souls of a farming society, it had to speak their language, it had to sanctify their labor. Religious festivals often coincided with key moments in the agricultural year, because that's when people needed them most. A celebration was needed to mark the end of the harvest, to release the tension. A blessing was needed before the plough broke the earth, to ask for help in the face of uncertainty. The fast of Lent happened when food was scarcest anyway, making a virtue of a harsh necessity. The feast of Easter happened as the world was coming back to life, mirroring the resurrection with the green shoots in the fields. This fusion created the psychological landscape of the medieval world. Life was governed by a powerful, predictable, and divinely ordained pattern. This can sound stifling to our modern ears, accustomed as we are to freedom and choice. But in a world beset by unpredictability, by disease, famine, and war, this rigid structure was a source of immense comfort and stability. Your life had a shape. You knew what was coming. You knew that after the hunger of Lent came the feast of Easter. You knew that after the back-breaking labor of the harvest came the joyous relief of the harvest home. You knew that in the deepest, darkest days of winter, the 12 days of Christmas would arrive like a sudden welcome fire. This cycle of work, fasting and feasting was the bedrock of society. It wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was the entirety of life. The parties and festivals we're going to explore weren't just tacked on for fun. They weren't diversions from real life. They were a fundamental part of its rhythm. They were the reward for the fast, the release from the labor. They were the moments when the community came together to affirm its survival, to thank God for its good fortune, and to forget for a short and precious time the incredible precariousness of its own existence. They were the punctuation marks in the long, difficult and cyclical sentence of medieval life. And without understanding this foundational rhythm, this deep, slow pulse of the calendars that governed every waking moment, we can't begin to understand the sheer explosive joy of the feast itself. Chapter 2. The Lord's Table. Feasting and power in the noble court. But that joy, that explosive release, it wasn't the same for everyone. For the peasant, a feast was a punctuation mark in a year of hard labor, a communal sigh of relief. It was about survival, about community, about the simple, profound happiness of a full belly and a brief respite from the ceaseless grind. For the nobility, however, it was something else entirely. For them, the feast was not a sigh of relief. It was a roar of dominance. It was a tool, a weapon, a meticulously crafted piece of theatre, where every dish, every goblet of wine, and every seat at the table was a calculated move in the great dangerous game of power. So let's leave the smoky, humble cottages behind for a moment. Let's walk up the hill, past the guards, their bored eyes following us as we cross the bailey. We're heading for the heart of the castle, the great hall, and as we push open the massive iron-strapped wooden doors, the change is immediate. The air is still thick with smoke. Yes, but it's a different kind of smoke. It's the haze from a dozen blazing torches set in iron sconces on the stone walls, and from the colossal fireplace, a cavernous maw large enough to roast an entire ox, which is very likely happening as we speak. The sheer scale of the place is the first thing that hits you. The ceilings soar upwards into a cathedral of darkness, a complex web of timber beams where shadows and soot have made a permanent home. The floor is not dirt, but stone flagstones, uneven and worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. And yet, it's almost completely hidden. It's covered in a thick layer of rushes, sweet-smelling herbs and winter straw. This was the medieval version of wall-to-wall carpeting, a feature that was both practical and, shall we say, a bit of an olfactory adventure. On the one hand, it provided a layer of insulation from the bone-deep chill of the stone. On the other, it was also a repository for everything that was dropped during a feast. Spilled ale, gnawed-on bones, scraps of food, it all found its way into the rushes. Historians politely call this an organic flooring solution. What it really means is that the floor was a slowly composting, ever-changing ecosystem, home to dogs, rats, and a smell that was a unique blend of a brewery, a butcher's shop, and a damp meadow. The household staff would occasionally add fresh herbs to the mix, which was the medieval equivalent of spraying air freshener in a locker room. A noble effort, but ultimately a losing battle. This vast echoing chamber was the medieval lord's multi-purpose room. It was his courtroom, his throne room, his administrative office, and tonight his dining hall. But to call it a dining hall is to miss the point entirely. It was a stage, and on this stage, a play about power was about to unfold. Look at the room's layout. At the far end, raised on a wooden platform called a dais, is the high table. This is the VIP section, the front row, the central focus of the entire room. It's covered with the finest linen cloth, impossibly white in the flickering torchlight. Here, and only here, you will see the family's wealth on full display. Silver goblets, ornate salt cellars, maybe even a gilded ewer for pouring wine. This is where the lord sits, flanked by his lady and the most important guests of honour, a visiting duke, a powerful bishop, or a knight who has just won a great victory. Their chairs are more elaborate, perhaps with carved armrests and cushioned seats, the medieval equivalent of first-class airline seating. Below the dais, stretching down the length of the hall, are the trestle tables, long, rough-hewn planks of wood, laid over simple supports. These could be set up and taken down as needed, making the hall a versatile space. And it's here, at these long tables, that the rest of the household is seated. But the seating is anything but random. It is a precise, visible map of the social order. The closer you were to the high table, the more important you were. The further away you sat, the lower you were in the pecking order. The great social dividing line was a piece of tableware we barely even think about. The salt cellar, often an incredibly ornate object made of silver or even gold, known as a neffe. The salt cellar sat on the high table. To be seated above the salt meant you were a person of consequence, a member of the inner circle. You were literally closer to the Lord and his precious, expensive salt. To be seated below the salt was to be one of the rank and file, the lesser knights, the men-at-arms, the various functionaries of the castle hierarchy. It was a constant public reminder of your exact place in the world. If you think the modern anxiety of creating a seating chart for a wedding reception is stressful, imagine doing it when placing someone 3 feet to the left of where they think they belong. Could be interpreted as a mortal insult, a slight against their family honour that might fester for decades. And once you found your spot on this rigid social map, you had to navigate the intricate etiquette of the meal itself. Forget what you know about modern dining. For most of medieval history, the fork was a strange foreign curiosity, often seen as an affectation. You ate with your fingers, your personal dagger, and a spoon for soups or potages. This wasn't considered rude, it was simply the way things were done. But there were rules, of course. You were expected to use only your right hand for eating, and preferably only 3 fingers. The left hand was for other things. In an age before widespread modern plumbing, cleanliness was a performance. Before the meal began, and between courses, servants would move through the hall, carrying a silver ewer of scented water and a basin, a lavabo for guests to rinse their fingers. It was a gesture of refinement and courtesy, in a world that was anything but. You didn't share plates, not in the modern sense. You might share a trencher. This was a thick slice of stale bread, about 6 inches square, that served as your plate. It would soak up the juices from the meat and gravies, and at the end of the meal, you could either eat your trencher if you were hungry, or more charitably, give it as alms to the poor waiting at the castle gates, or, far more likely, you'd toss it to one of the dozens of dogs that roamed the great hall, a permanent and very enthusiastic clean-up crew, weaving between the legs of the diners, waiting for a generous handout. You would also share a drinking cup. A single large goblet, often called a loving cup, would be passed down the table, from which multiple people would drink. It was a symbol of fellowship and trust, a statement that said, "We are all of this household, and we trust each other enough not to poison this cup." A lovely sentiment. though perhaps less reassuring from a modern epidemiological perspective. Then, the meal itself would begin, and it was never just about the food, it was about the spectacle. The start of the feast was announced not by a gentle dinner bell, but by a blast of trumpets from a minstrel's gallery high above the hall. This was the overture. What followed was a procession, a parade of culinary theatre. Servants would march into the hall in a long line, each bearing a platter high. The first course would arrive, a dizzying array of dishes laid out all at once. This was not the modern starter main dessert structure. It was an overwhelming display of abundance. You might see a whole roasted pig, a fleet of smaller birds, meat pies decorated with intricate pastry castles, and jellies shimmering in multiple colours. But the real status symbols were the things that came from far away, or the things that were transformed into something fantastical. The most important of these was spice. Today we think of spices as a way to add flavour. We complain if our curry isn't quite hot enough. In the Middle Ages, spices were the ultimate luxury good. They were a direct edible advertisement of your wealth and connections. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, saffron, and especially cinnamon had to travel thousands of miles across treacherous trade routes from Asia and the Middle East, passing through countless middlemen, each adding their own markup. To use them lavishly, to the point of almost overpowering the food, was the medieval equivalent of wearing a giant diamond necklace to a dinner party. It wasn't just about taste, it was about broadcasting, in the most direct way possible, that you were fantastically, obscenely wealthy. A lord might spend more on the spices for a single feast than he would on a knight's armour. And then there was the presentation. The cooks and their staff were not just chefs, they were artists and illusionists. A favourite centrepiece for a truly important feast was a roasted swan or peacock, painstakingly redressed in its own feathers after cooking so that it looked as though it was still alive, its beak often gilded with gold leaf. It was beautiful, impressive, and according to most accounts, incredibly tough and not very pleasant to eat. But that wasn't the point. You weren't eating a peacock because it was delicious. You were eating it because you could. You were consuming a symbol of beauty and rarity, demonstrating your power over the natural world. The ultimate expression of this culinary theatre was a dish known as a subtlety or an entremet. These were served between the main courses, and they were essentially elaborate, edible sculptures. Imagine a castle crafted from marzipan and sugar paste, complete with tiny banners bearing the Lord's coat of arms, or a mythological scene, St. George slaying the dragon, sculpted entirely from almond paste and jelly. Sometimes they were designed to be interactive and surprising. A pie might be placed on the table, and when the crust was cut, live birds would fly out and flutter up to the rafters of the great hall. A boar's head might be carried in, its mouth bristling with tusks and breathing fire, a trick accomplished with a wad of alcohol-soaked cotton set alight just before it entered the hall. These subtleties were not just for fun, they were edible propaganda. They might depict a recent victory in battle, with the Lord's knights, made of sugar, triumphing over their enemies. They might tell a story from the family's lineage, reinforcing their ancient and noble claim to power. Every guest in the hall would see it, marvel at it, and understand the message being sent without a single word being spoken. It was a way of saying, not only can I afford to feed you all, but I can afford to turn my food into art, into a story that stars me as the hero. All of this was washed down with staggering quantities of drink, wine for those at the high table, and the most important guests was a high-status beverage, often imported at great expense from France. The Lord's cupbearer was a position of enormous trust, as the fear of poison was very real. He would often taste the wine himself before pouring it for his master. Further down the tables, the drink of choice was ale, brewed in the castle's own brewhouse. And just like the seating, the quality of the ale often declined the further you were from the dais. The best ale for the knights, and a weaker, small beer for the lower-ranking servants at the far end of the hall. The goal was to create a sense of generosity and celebration, to loosen tongues and build camaraderie, but always within the established hierarchy. A happy household was a loyal household, but a household that never forgot who was in charge. And as the feast wore on, course after course, subtlety after subtlety, the entertainment would begin in earnest. The background music from the minstrels would give way to performances. A troubadour might step forward to sing an epic poem, a chanson de geste, recounting the heroic deeds of Charlemagne, or more pointedly, the heroic deeds of the host himself. It was a live-action musical press release, reminding everyone in the room of the Lord's martial prowess and noble character. Then there was the jester, or the court fool. This was a fascinating and complex role. The jester was one of the very few people in the entire hierarchy who was allowed and even expected to speak truth to power. Dressed in his motley and capped with bells, he could mock the guests, make pointed jokes about the Lord's policies, and highlight the absurdity of the court's rigid etiquette. He was the pressure valve. His humour could diffuse tension and offer criticism in a way no one else would dare, all under the protected guise of foolishness. He was both an insider and an outsider, a person of incredible wit and observation, whose job it was to remind these powerful people, just for a moment, of their own humanity and folly. Acrobats, jugglers, and storytellers would wander between the tables. Perhaps a travelling poet would recite the latest romance from the courts of Aquitaine. The noise level would rise to a din, the music, the laughter, the shouting, the clatter of knives on trenchers, the barking of the dogs. It was a multi-sensory assault, a carnival of choreographed chaos designed to overwhelm and impress. Imagine you are a minor knight, visiting this court for the first time, hoping to gain the Lord's favour. You are seated somewhere below the salt. You watch the endless procession of exotic foods you've only ever heard stories about. You see the peacock, shimmering in the torchlight. You marvel at the sugar castle. You listen to the songs praising your host's invincible might. You drink his wine, or at least his second-best ale. Every single element of the evening is designed to instill in you a sense of awe and a very clear understanding of your own relative insignificance. It is a masterclass in psychological dominance. The feast could go on for hours, sometimes for days, especially to celebrate a wedding, a major religious holiday, or a military victory. It was an enormous drain on the castle's resources, requiring months of planning and stockpiling. But it was never considered a waste. It was an investment. It was how alliances were sealed, with toasts drunk from a shared cup. It was how loyalty was rewarded, with a full belly and a place at the table. It was how rivals were intimidated, with a display of wealth so vast it bordered on the magical. As the night deepens, and the torches burn low, casting long, dancing shadows up the stone walls, the great hall transforms. The formal play of power gives way to a more boisterous, drunken revelry, but the purpose has been served. The hierarchy has been reinforced. The messages have been sent and received. The Lord at his high table, looking down over the smoky, chaotic, and now very well-fed room, has demonstrated his power not with a sword, but with a feast. He has shown that he presides over a world of incredible abundance in an age of general scarcity, and in doing so, he has cemented his place at the very centre of his world, the sun around which all the lesser planets in his hall must orbit. The feast was never just a meal. It was the entire social and political order of the medieval world, served up on a platter, and as the last of the guests stumble out into the cold night air, their heads swimming with wine and wonder, that is the one lesson they would never forget. Chapter 3. The Common Joy. Village Festivals and Parish Merriment. But as the last of those guests stumble out into the cold night air, their heads swimming with wine and wonder, they leave that world behind. They pass through the great stone gatehouse, leaving the torchlight and the music of the hall for a different reality, the world of the 99%. For every lord holding court in his great hall, there were 1,000 villagers whose lives were not measured in courses of roasted swan, but in the slow, unyielding turning of the seasons. Their world was not the perfumed, tapestried bubble of the castle, but the vast, muddy, wind-swept stage of the open fields. And while the Lord's feast was a performance of power, a spectacle to be observed, joy for the common person was something else entirely. It wasn't a gift handed down from on high. It was something they had to make for themselves, with their own hands, on their own terms, in the brief, precious moments they could steal back from the land. So let's leave the castle behind us. Let's walk down the path from the great house on the hill, our feet finding the ruts in the muddy track. The air changes. The smell of wood smoke and damp earth and livestock replaces the scent of beeswax and spiced wine. This is where most people lived, and this is where we'll find a different kind of celebration, one that was perhaps more vital, more necessary than any courtly feast. We're looking for the common joy. To understand a medieval village festival, you first have to understand the silence and the labour that surrounded it. Imagine a life dictated not by a clock or a calendar on your phone, but by the sun. You rise before it does, your body already aching from yesterday's work. You spend your day in the fields, under that same sun, or under a sky the colour of wet slate, performing the same repetitive, muscle-shredding tasks. Ploughing, sowing, weeding, reaping. Your world is a radius of a few miles around the place you were born. The soundtrack to your life isn't a curated playlist. It's the wind, the lowing of oxen, the cry of birds, and the rhythmic thud of your own tools against the earth. This wasn't a 9-to-5 job with weekends off. This was a relentless, horizon-to-horizon struggle for survival. Labour was the water in which they swam. It was everything, and the pressure was immense. A week of bad rain at the wrong time, a blight on the crops, a sickness in the flock. These weren't inconveniences. They were existential threats. Starvation was never a distant, abstract concept. It was a hungry wolf that lived just at the edge of the woods, always watching, always waiting for the village to stumble. And so the festival, the party, was not a luxury. It was a psychological necessity. It was a collective, deep, shuddering exhalation. It was the moment the entire community stopped, looked around at each other, and acknowledged that they had survived. They had made it through the planting, or the lambing, or the harvest. The wolf was for now held at bay. These festivals were punctuation marks in a long, run-on sentence of hard labour. They were the essential glue that held the entire social fabric together, a way of reaffirming bonds in a world where you absolutely could not survive alone. If you fell, you needed your neighbour to pick you up. The festival was where you remembered you had neighbours. So where did these celebrations happen? There was no community centre, no rented hall. The venue was the village itself. The primary stage was often the village green, that patch of common land that was the closest thing the village had to a shared front yard. It was a bumpy, uneven patch of grass, probably dotted with evidence of grazing sheep, but on a festival day, it became the centre of the universe. The other key location, perhaps surprisingly to us, was the church. The medieval church wasn't the quiet, hushed, solemn place we might imagine today. Its authority was absolute. Its role in daily life was all-encompassing. But the building itself and the yard around it were hubs of community life. The nave of the church might be used for markets or even for storing grain in an emergency, and the churchyard wasn't just for burials. It was a public park, and it was here that one of the most common and vital types of village gatherings took place: the parish ale. Now, when you hear parish ale, don't think of a quiet, polite coffee morning after the service. Think of a rowdy, day-long outdoor beer festival and fundraiser, all rolled into one. The concept was simple. The church, like any large building, always needed repairs. The roof was leaking, the bell tower was crumbling, or perhaps the parish needed to buy new vestments for the priest. These things cost money, and peasants didn't exactly have a lot of disposable income, so they turned to what they did have: grain, and the knowledge of how to turn it into alcohol. The event was organised by the church wardens, the lay people responsible for the upkeep of the church. They would announce the ale weeks in advance. Certain women in the village, known as alewives or brewsters, would be tasked with the brewing. This was a serious business. A village's reputation could hang on the quality of its ale, and a bad batch could ruin the whole affair. They would brew gallons upon gallons of it, a strong, thick, nutritious brew, unfiltered and probably a bit cloudy, served not in delicate glasses but in leather jacks or earthenware mugs. On the day of the festival, long trestle tables would be set up in the churchyard. The entire village would turn out. You paid a certain price for your first mug of ale, and then you drank for the good of the church. It was your Christian duty to have another round, for the roof, for the new bell, for the poor box. It was a brilliant model of fundraising, really. The more you drank, the more pious you were. All the proceeds went to the church, paying for its maintenance, and by extension, ensuring the spiritual well-being of the community. The atmosphere would have been electric. After weeks of back-breaking work, this was a release. The air would be thick with the malty smell of the ale, the smoke from a fire roasting an ox or a pig if the parish was wealthy, but more likely the simple, honest smell of baking bread and sharp cheese. The noise would be a happy cacophony, not polite chatter, but loud talk, raucous laughter, and the inevitable arguments that flare up when an entire village gets together and starts drinking at noon. Children would be running wild through the gravestones, playing games of tag. Young men and women would be engaging in the age-old tradition of unsubtle flirting, their glances and laughter carrying more weight in the open air of the festival than they ever could during a somber church service. This was where the real business of the village got done. Gossip was exchanged, the medieval information superhighway in full effect. Deals were struck with a handshake, grudges might be aired, and with the help of a few ales, perhaps even settled, or started. It could go either way, really. A parish ale was a pressure cooker for village life, intensifying every relationship, every friendship, every rivalry. It was messy, it was loud, it was deeply human, and it was all in the name of fixing the church roof. But these fundraising ales were just one type of celebration. The more profound festivals were those tied not to the needs of a building, but to the very rhythm of the earth itself, and none was more joyous, more vibrant with a kind of primal energy than the celebration of May Day. Winter in the medieval world wasn't just an inconvenience, a time for cozy sweaters and scenic snowfalls. It was a genuine monster. It was the wolf month, a time of darkness, cold and gnawing hunger. The stores of grain from the harvest dwindled. The cold was a physical enemy that seeped through the wattle and daub walls of your hut, a damp, relentless presence that you could never escape. Forget about arguments over the thermostat. The main goal was simply not to wake up as a permanent part of the room's ice sculpture collection. People, like the world around them, huddled, conserved their energy, and prayed for the sun to return. And then it did, slowly, tentatively. The world began to wake up. The first green shoots appeared, the days grew longer, the air lost its vicious bite. This return of life was not something to be taken for granted. It felt like a genuine miracle, a divine promise fulfilled. And May Day, or Beltane in the older pagan traditions, was the great explosive celebration of that miracle. It was the day the world turned from grey to green. The heart of the May Day celebration was the maypole. This wasn't just a decorative bit of fun, it was a deeply symbolic ritual. In the early morning, the young people of the village would go out into the woods in a great, noisy procession. This was called bringing in the May. They would select a tall, straight tree, usually a birch, and fell it with great ceremony. Then they would haul it back to the village green, an act that required the cooperation of dozens of hands. The tree was stripped of its branches, save for a few at the very top, and decorated lavishly. Wildflowers were woven into garlands, and long, colourful ribbons were attached to the peak. Erecting the maypole was the central act. It was hoisted upright and set into a deep hole, standing as the new temporary centre of their world. It was a potent symbol, pulsing with meaning. It was a link between the earth and the sky, a celebration of the surging fertility of the land, a giant joyful exclamation mark on the landscape. Once the pole was up, the real festivities began. A May Queen, and sometimes a May King, or a Green Man, would be chosen from among the village youth. This wasn't a formal election, it was more of an acclamation. They chose the prettiest girl, the most handsome boy. For that one day, these two peasant children were royalty. The May Queen, crowned with a wreath of flowers, would preside over the day's events. It was a little moment of fantasy, a playful inversion of the rigid social hierarchy they lived under the other 364 days of the year. The main event was the dancing. A musician, perhaps with a simple pipe and a small drum called a tabor, or a scraping fiddle, would strike up a tune. The villagers would take the long ribbons and weave intricate patterns as they danced around the pole, circling in opposite directions. The dance was a ritual in itself, a way of wrapping the community and their hopes for a fertile season right around the symbol of life itself. The music was simple, the rhythms infectious, designed for communal joy, not for quiet appreciation. And May Day had a wilder, less wholesome side to it, a legacy of its pagan roots that the church was never entirely comfortable with. The trip into the woods to fetch the maypole was famously an opportunity for young couples to slip away from watchful eyes. There was an air of license about May Day, a sense of rules being relaxed. It was a celebration of fertility in all its forms, human as well as agricultural. The Puritans who came centuries later would famously rail against the maypole as a stinking idol, and May Day as an excuse for all sorts of sin. And they weren't entirely wrong. It was a day of earthy, uninhibited joy. It was a necessary release, a moment to remember that life was not just about toil and prayer, but also about passion, connection, and the simple, profound beauty of a world coming back to life. If May Day was the great party of spring, the explosive promise of the season to come, then its bookend was the harvest home, the great party of the autumn, and this one was different. It lacked the frantic, hopeful energy of May Day. Instead, it was infused with a deeper, more profound emotion. Relief. The harvest was the single most important event of the year. It was the climax of the entire agricultural drama. Everything, absolutely everything, depended on successfully getting the crops in from the fields. It was a period of intense, frantic work for the entire community. From dawn until dusk, every able-bodied person, from the smallest child who could carry a bundle of wheat to the oldest man who could still swing a scythe, was in the fields. The work was brutal. Scythes and sickles were sharp. The sun was often hot, and the stalks of grain could cut your hands to ribbons. You worked until your back was a knot of fire and your arms felt like lead. You worked against time, against the threat of a sudden rainstorm that could ruin the entire crop and doom the village to a winter of starvation. And then, one day, it was done. The last sheaf of grain was gathered from the field and brought into the barn. Imagine that moment, the collective letting go of a breath that has been held for weeks, the aching muscles, the exhaustion, but underneath it all, a deep, bone-felt satisfaction. They had done it. They had won. The stores were full. The wolf at the edge of the forest would have to wait another year. This was the reason for the Harvest Home Festival. It wasn't just a party. It was a victory celebration. A crucial element of this festival was the role of the lord of the manor. Throughout the year, the relationship between lord and peasant was one of obligation and power imbalance. But at Harvest Home, a specific feudal custom often kicked in. The lord was obligated to provide a feast for his tenants to thank them for their labour. This harvest supper was a pivotal event. It was a moment where the lord acknowledged his dependence on the people who worked his land. The feast would be held in the lord's great hall, or if it was a smaller manor, perhaps in a large barn. For one night, the peasants entered the world of their superiors. The food would be a dream of abundance. Instead of the usual monotonous diet of bread, cheese, and vegetable pottage, there would be meat. A pig or a goose might be roasted over a great fire. There would be pies, puddings, and perhaps even delicacies they'd only heard stories about. And there would be ale, not just a mug or two, but barrels of it, flowing freely. For this one night, the Lord encouraged them to eat and drink their fill. It was both a reward and a shrewd investment in goodwill for the year to come. A fascinating tradition at many of these feasts was the election of a Lord of the Harvest. The peasants themselves would choose one of their own to preside over the meal. This temporary king, often dressed in mock finery made of straw and flowers, would sit at the head of the table and direct the festivities. He could make speeches, issue comical decrees, and generally parody the real lord, who was often present and expected to take the joke in good grace. It was a brilliant piece of social theatre, a sanctioned moment of misrule that allowed the peasants to harmlessly vent some of the frustrations of their powerless position. It was a way of saying, yes, you are the lord all year, but tonight we are all kings. The atmosphere of the Harvest Home was one of weary, joyous camaraderie. These people had struggled together, side by side in the fields. Now they feasted together. They would sing songs, not prim and proper church hymns, but bawdy, boisterous harvest songs, with dozens of verses that got progressively more slurred as the night wore on. They would tell stories. They would celebrate their shared victory over the land and the weather. As the night drew to a close, they would stumble back to their huts, their bellies fuller than at any other time of the year, their hearts full of the simple, powerful joy of a job well done. The memory of that one night of abundance, that one taste of the good life, would have to sustain them through the long, lean months of the winter ahead. Of course, a festival isn't just about food and drink and symbolic rituals. It's about having fun. It's about playing games. And the games of the medieval village green were a far cry from our modern, highly regulated sports. They were chaotic, often violent, and deeply ingrained in the fabric of village life. One of the most common sports was wrestling. This wasn't the theatrical wrestling we see on television. This was a raw, powerful contest of strength and skill. Young men would grapple on the village green, their bare feet digging into the turf, cheered on by the entire community. Different regions had their own styles. Some, like the Cornish style, were highly technical, others were less so. In some parts of England, they practiced a sport that was politely called shin kicking. The goal here was pretty much what it sounds like. Two men would hold each other by the shoulders and take turns kicking each other in the shins until one of them fell over. It was brutal, it was painful, and it was considered excellent entertainment. It was also a way for young men to establish a pecking order, to prove their toughness, and to settle disputes without resorting to more lethal weapons. Archery was another pillar of village entertainment, but it was one with a much more serious purpose. The longbow was the great English superweapon of the late Middle Ages, and the crown needed a constant supply of skilled archers. Laws were passed requiring all able-bodied men to practice with the bow on Sundays and holy days after church, so the archery contest at a village festival was both a game and a form of military training. Each village would have a set of archery butts, large mounds of earth with targets set on them. The competition would be fierce, with a prize for the best archer, perhaps a silver penny or a ribbon from the May Queen. A village's reputation could be made or broken by the skill of its bowmen. It fostered a sense of local pride and provided the king with a ready-made army. But for sheer, unadulterated chaos, nothing could match the medieval game of football. If you are picturing a neatly manicured pitch with 22 players and a referee, you need to erase that image from your mind entirely. Medieval football, or mob football, was less a sport and more a village-wide riot with a ball. The ball was typically an inflated pig's bladder. The pitch could be the entire space between two villages, stretching for miles. The goals might be the church door of one village and the mill of the other. And the teams? The teams were essentially everyone. All the men of one village against all the men of the other. The rules were minimal and often boiled down to get the ball to the goal by any means necessary. This included kicking, punching, gouging, and tackling. There was no concept of offside or foul play. The game would surge through fields, across streams, and down the muddy main street of the village. Windows were broken, fences were trampled, bones were broken, people occasionally died. The authorities hated it. King after king passed laws trying to ban football, seeing it as a public nuisance and a distraction from the much more useful practice of archery. But it was impossible to stamp out. It was too popular, too deeply rooted in local rivalries. It was a massive, violent and exhilarating release of pent-up aggression. It was a way for a community to come together in a shared, if utterly insane, purpose. It was the ultimate expression of local identity. You weren't just a person, you were a man from this village, and you would fight, bleed and trample your neighbour's prize-winning cabbages to prove your village was the best. Of course, not all the games were so violent. Women and children had their own pastimes. A game called stool ball was popular, an ancestor of both cricket and baseball, where one person would throw a ball at an upturned stool, while another tried to bat it away with their hand or a stick. There were running races, games of tag like Hoodman Blind, a variation of Blind Man's Buff, and of course there was dancing. Dancing was everywhere, not the formal, structured dances of the aristocracy, but simple, energetic circle dances and line dances, performed to the tune of a fiddle or a pipe. It was a way to socialize, a way to move your body, a way to be close to someone you fancied. It was joy in its purest, most physical form. It's important, as we imagine these scenes of rustic merriment, not to over-romanticize them. These were not idyllic scenes from a fantasy novel. They were gatherings of real, flawed human beings in a harsh and unforgiving world. The ale that fueled the joy also fueled violence. A friendly wrestling match could easily turn into a serious brawl if old grudges were brought to the surface. The intense rivalry of a football game could spill over into genuine animosity between villages that lasted for generations. And the authorities, both secular and religious, were always a little nervous about these festivals. A large gathering of peasants full of ale and righteous indignation was a dangerous thing. A festival could be the spark that lit the fire of a riot or a revolt. The church, while encouraging the parish ales that paid for its upkeep, was deeply suspicious of the pagan undertones of May Day. Priests would preach against the licentiousness, the drunkenness, and the worship of stocks and stones. The lords of the manor, while providing the harvest supper, were always aware that the temporary Lord of the Harvest was a parody of their own power, a reminder that the social order was not as stable as they liked to believe. There was always a tension, a fine line between sanctioned celebration and dangerous subversion. But despite all this, these festivals were the lifeblood of the community. In our modern world, so much of our entertainment is private. We sit on our own sofas, watching our own screens, listening through our own headphones. We curate our own individual bubbles of joy. For the medieval peasant, joy was almost exclusively a public and communal experience. You couldn't afford to have a private party. You couldn't stream a movie. Joy was something you did together, out in the open, with everyone you knew. It was the shared laughter at the antics of the Lord of the Harvest. It was the collective gasp as an arrow struck the very center of the target. It was the feeling of your hand in your neighbor's as you danced around the maypole. It was the shared song, sung out of tune but with immense feeling, after the last sheaf was brought in. It was the knowledge that you were not alone in your struggle. You were part of a village, a community, a we that worked together, suffered together, and on these precious fleeting days, celebrated together. And so, as the bonfire on the village green dies down to a pile of glowing embers, and the last of the dancers make their way home through the dark, a quiet falls. The only sounds are the chirp of crickets and the distant bark of a dog. The people return to their small, smoky homes, their bodies tired from the dancing and the games, their bellies full, their minds still buzzing with the noise and the laughter. The festival is over. The long, silent days of work will begin again with the sunrise. But something has been rekindled, bonds have been strengthened, the spirit of the community has been renewed, and the memory of that shared common joy is a small, warm light that they will carry with them into the darkness, a promise that after the work is done, there will be a time for dancing once more. Chapter 4. Sacred Spectacle, Processions, Pilgrimage, and Mystery Plays. But that shared common joy, that small, warm light carried into the darkness, it wasn't always found in a flagon of ale or a wild, chaotic dance around a bonfire. Sometimes that light was a different colour. It was the solemn, flickering gold of 1,000 candles held in steady hands. Sometimes the community wasn't just renewing its own spirit, but performing a grand renewal of its bond with the heavens themselves. Because what if the party wasn't just a break from the work? What if the party was the work, the most important work of all, in their eyes, the ongoing, never-ending project of pleasing God and saving your immortal soul? This was a different kind of festival. It wasn't about escaping the rules. It was about celebrating them in the most magnificent public way imaginable. This was a spectacle that didn't just take place in the town square. It turned the entire town, every street and alley, into a stage. It painted the grey, timber-framed world in the vibrant, terrifying and glorious colours of heaven and hell. We move now from the earthly delights of the harvest feast to the sacred spectacle of the religious festival, and we must understand, for the medieval mind, the line between the two was often beautifully, wonderfully blurred. Piety wasn't a quiet, internal, private affair, whispered in the dark. It was loud, it was dramatic, it was a performance for an audience of your neighbours, your betters, and most importantly, an audience of God, His angels, and His saints. It was faith as street theatre. Let's begin with the most orderly, the most visually stunning, and the most socially significant of these events, the procession. Now, when we think of a parade today, we might picture giant cartoon character balloons, high school marching bands, and people on floats tossing candy to the crowd. A medieval procession had some of that same energy, the excitement, the break from the norm, the sense of a shared public moment, but its purpose was infinitely more serious. It wasn't an advertisement for a department store. It was a living, breathing diagram of the entire universe as they understood it. Imagine a city like York, or Coventry, or London, on the feast of Corpus Christi. This was one of the biggest days in the liturgical calendar, a day dedicated to celebrating the mystery of the Eucharist, the belief that the bread and wine of communion were, quite literally, the body and blood of Christ. This wasn't just a metaphor to them. It was a profound, terrifying and miraculous reality, and a miracle of that magnitude demanded a party. A very, very big and very, very organised party. Weeks beforehand, the preparations would begin. The first order of business was what we might politely call a deep clean. The streets, which on a normal day were a fragrant obstacle course of mud, animal dung, and discarded refuse, were scraped and cleared. Householders were ordered to sweep the patch of ground before their own doors, a task they likely undertook with a level of grumbling enthusiasm, familiar to anyone who's ever been told to clean their room for visiting relatives. But this was for a relative of cosmic importance. Then the decorations. The grey, muddy streets were transformed. Rushes and fragrant herbs and wildflowers were strewn across the ground, releasing a sweet green scent as they were crushed underfoot, a desperate but noble attempt to overpower the city's default aroma. Wealthy merchants and nobles would hang their finest tapestries from their upper-story windows. These weren't just decorative cloths. They were immense, woven storybooks depicting biblical scenes, heroic hunts or family crests. They were a declaration of wealth and piety, a way of saying, "Look at us, we are so successful, so blessed, that we can afford to use our most valuable possessions as public wallpaper for a day." The whole town was dressed in its Sunday best. And then, on the day itself, the bells would begin, not just one church bell, but all of them, a clanging, joyous, inescapable chorus that announced the beginning of the great performance. And from the doors of the main cathedral or collegiate church, the procession would emerge. This was not a haphazard crowd. This was a meticulously planned, rigidly hierarchical river of humanity. And your place in that river told everyone, from the humblest apprentice to God himself, exactly who you were. It was the medieval social order made visible, set to music. At the very front, paradoxically, were often the lowest orders. The children from the parish schools, perhaps, their faces scrubbed clean for the occasion, chanting simple hymns. Then came the lay fraternities, the religious social clubs of the town, followed by the guilds. And here, the real drama began. The guilds were the backbone of the medieval city, the organizations of craftsmen and merchants, the tanners, the bakers, the weavers, the goldsmiths. Each guild marched as a single unit, and their position in the procession was a matter of intense civic pride and frequently bitter dispute. The so-called lesser guilds went first. The butchers, the tanners, the chandlers, crafts that were essential but perhaps a little messy or smelly. They marched proudly, holding aloft great painted banners bearing the symbols of their craft. A cleaver, a stretched hide, a candle. They might carry enormous decorated candles, their flames flickering in the breeze. Each guild member would be wearing the official livery of their organization, a uniform of specific colors that made them stand out. It was a team sport. They were marching for their own salvation, yes, but also for the honor of the Tanners Guild, Local 15. As the procession continued, the guilds grew in wealth and prestige. The weavers, the drapers, the vintners, their banners were more elaborate, woven with silver and gold thread. Their liveries were made of finer cloth. The air grew thicker with the smell of expensive beeswax candles, a clear olfactory signal of status. Arguments over which guild got to march ahead of another could simmer for years, sometimes breaking out into actual brawls that disrupted the very piety they were meant to be displaying. The fishmongers are marching ahead of us. Unacceptable. Our craft is far more dignified. It was the sacred medieval equivalent of arguing over seating charts at a wedding. After the guilds came the town's own government. The aldermen, the councillors, the mayor, all clad in their robes of office, heavy with fur and velvet, their chains of office glinting in the sun. They walked with a solemn dignity that befitted the rulers of this little kingdom of commerce. They were the temporal power of the city, now humbly submitting itself to the spiritual power that followed. And then the clergy, a long line of priests in their finest vestments, acolytes swinging censers, brass containers that billowed clouds of fragrant, intoxicating incense smoke. The smell of frankincense and myrrh would fill the street, a scent utterly alien to the daily smells of wood smoke and manure. It was the smell of heaven, the smell of the holy. Monks and friars from the local monasteries would be there, their rough-spun habits a stark contrast to the priests' finery. Their voices joined in deep, resonant Latin chants. Most of the people lining the streets wouldn't understand a word of the Latin, but that didn't matter. The sound itself was prayer. It was powerful, mysterious, and deeply moving. Finally, the climax of the whole affair. At the very heart of the procession, walking beneath a magnificent, ornate canopy of silk and gold held aloft on 4 poles by the most prominent citizens of the town, came the highest-ranking cleric, the bishop or abbot. And he wasn't the star of the show, he was merely the vehicle. In his hands he held the monstrance. This was a vessel of staggering beauty, usually fashioned from solid gold or silver, intricately worked, and often studded with precious gems. And inside, behind a small crystal window, was a single, consecrated communion wafer, the host, the body of Christ. This was the whole point. This was God, made visible, being carried through the streets of their town. All the bells, all the incense, all the banners and chanting. It was all for this. As this central point of the procession passed, the crowds would fall to their knees in the dusty, herb-strewn street. Hats were removed, heads were bowed, a hush would fall, broken only by the bells and the chanting. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. The divine was literally present, moving past the butcher's shop, past the weaver's cottage, past the tavern on the corner. It was an incredible, electrifying moment of collective belief. Heaven had touched earth, right there on their high street. Following the canopy might be the local nobility, the knights and ladies of the region, dressed in fabrics so fine and colours so vibrant they seemed to belong to another world. Their presence was a reminder of the third pillar of their society, those who fight, joining those who work, the guilds, and those who pray, the clergy. Everyone was in their proper place, creating a perfect moving portrait of a stable, divinely ordained society. The procession would wind its way through the entire town, a slow, solemn, spectacular journey. It would stop at various outdoor altars that had been set up, where prayers would be said and blessings given. It was an exercise in sanctifying the profane. By carrying the host through the city, they were in a sense reconsecrating their entire community, cleansing the streets, blessing the homes, and reminding everyone of the sacred that lay just beneath the surface of their mundane workaday lives. And for the individual, what did it feel like to be a weaver, marching with your fellows, your guild's banner snapping in the wind above you? It was a feeling of belonging, of pride. You were not just an anonymous craftsman, you were part of the worshipful company of weavers, and your company had a vital role to play in the spiritual health of the city. To be a child watching from a doorway, eyes wide at the sight of the gleaming gold, the smell of the strange, sweet smoke, the sound of the mysterious, powerful music, it was pure magic. It was awe. It was a storybook come to life, a confirmation that all the tales the priest told in church were real, and they were happening right now, right in front of you. When the procession finally returned to the church, when the last chant had faded and the last bell had fallen silent, the town was left subtly changed. The visual and social order of the universe had been demonstrated, and everyone had seen their place within it. It was a reassurance. In a world of uncertainty, of plague and famine and sudden death, the procession offered a vision of perfect, unshakable order, an order that stretched from the lowest apprentice all the way up to God in his heaven, and that, in its own way, was as comforting as any harvest feast. But faith wasn't always about staying put and celebrating as a community within the town walls. Sometimes the most profound act of faith was to leave, to walk away from the familiar, from the security of your home and your guild, and to set out on a long, arduous and deeply uncertain journey. This was the age of the pilgrim. Pilgrimage was one of the great spiritual phenomena of the Middle Ages. It was a journey to a holy place, a shrine that housed the relic of a saint. A relic could be anything: a piece of bone, a fragment of clothing, a drop of blood, an object the saint had touched. To the medieval mind, these weren't just historical artifacts. The saint wasn't truly dead, but alive in heaven, and their relics retained a fraction of their holy power, a direct line to the divine. If you were sick, if you had committed a terrible sin, if you wanted to give thanks for a great blessing, you went to the source, you went to the saint, and so the roads of Europe were filled with them, a constant, slow-moving traffic of souls on foot. We have this romantic image, perhaps from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, of a jolly group of travellers telling stories as they amble through a sunny English countryside, and there was certainly some of that. But the reality of pilgrimage was a far more demanding and often dangerous undertaking. It was, in many ways, the ultimate medieval adventure. First, you had to decide to go. This was not a casual decision. Like planning a weekend getaway, for a peasant tied to the land, it meant seeking permission from their lord, a request that might not be granted. For a craftsman, It meant shutting down their business for weeks, even months, losing income, and trusting that their competitors wouldn't steal all their customers. It was a huge sacrifice. The motivation had to be powerful. Perhaps your child was sick with a fever that no local healer could break. The only hope left was to promise St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes, that if he would only intervene, you would walk 200 miles to his shrine to give thanks. Perhaps you had been ordered by a priest to go on a pilgrimage as penance for a sin, a public act of repentance that showed everyone how sorry you were. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it was a chance to see the world. For most people, the world consisted of the village they were born in, and the next village over. A pilgrimage to Canterbury, or Rome, or even the legendary Santiago de Compostela in Spain, was the equivalent of a trip to the moon. It was a once-in-a-lifetime chance to escape the crushing routine of daily life. Once the decision was made, you prepared. The pilgrim had a sort of uniform, a long, coarse woolen cloak, a wide-brimmed hat to protect against sun and rain, a sturdy wooden staff, useful for walking and for fending off the less-than-pious dogs, both animal and human, that one might encounter on the road, and a small leather pouch or satchel called a scrip. This held everything you owned, a little money, a piece of bread, perhaps a letter of introduction from your local priest. You were the original minimalist backpacker. Before leaving, you would attend a special mass at your local church. The priest would bless you, your staff and your scrip. You would say your goodbyes to your family and friends. There were no guarantees you would ever see them again. And then you would walk out of your village, turn onto the main road, and join the stream. The journey itself was an assault on the senses and the body. The roads were what we would politely call unimproved. They were unpaved tracks of dirt that turned to thick, grasping mud in the rain and choking dust in the sun. There were no road signs. You navigated by word of mouth, by following other pilgrims, or by keeping a particular landmark in your sights. Your feet, likely clad in simple leather turn shoes with no arch support whatsoever, would ache, then blister, then bleed. Every day was a grueling march, from sun-up to sundown, and it was dangerous. The great forests of medieval Europe weren't quaint nature preserves. They were dark, menacing places. There were wolves, there were boars, and most of all, there were people who saw a lone traveller as an opportunity. Bandits and robbers were a constant threat. To travel alone was to invite disaster. This is why pilgrims so often travelled in groups. This is the reality behind Chaucer's fiction. You would fall in with other people heading in the same direction. A knight, a miller, a weaver, a nun, a pardoner from Rome. People from every walk of life whose paths would never otherwise cross were thrown together by the shared reality of the road. Your social status still mattered, of course, but it was softened by a new, temporary identity. You were all simply pilgrims. And this is where the magic happened. To pass the long, weary miles, they talked. They told stories. The knight would tell of his campaigns in France. The miller would tell a bawdy joke he'd heard at the local tavern. The nun would recount a pious story of a saint's miracle. They shared their food. They shared their fears. And they looked out for one another. A bond was forged in the dust and mud of the road, a temporary community of strangers united by a common purpose. At night, they would seek shelter. A monastery might offer a bed on the floor of a guest house and a simple meal, or they might find a crowded, noisy inn where they would have to share a bed with several complete strangers, sleeping in their clothes and hoping their purse was still with them in the morning. Sanitation was aspirational. The food was questionable, but it was shelter. It was a brief respite before the road called to them again at dawn. And finally, after weeks or even months of this, you would arrive, you would crest a hill, and there in the distance you would see it, the towering spires of the great cathedral you had walked so far to reach, Canterbury, Cologne, Compostela. The sight itself was a reward. These buildings were the skyscrapers of their age, marvels of engineering and art, designed to humble the viewer and draw their eyes and thoughts toward heaven. As you entered the city, the atmosphere would change. The streets would be thronged with other pilgrims from all over Christendom, a babble of different languages and dialects, and a new industry would reveal itself, the tourist trade. There were innkeepers shouting to advertise their rooms, there were food vendors selling pies and roasted meats, and everywhere there were the sellers of souvenirs. The most important souvenir was the pilgrim badge. These were small, mass-produced trinkets made of cheap pewter or lead alloy. Each shrine had its own unique design: a scallop shell for Santiago de Compostela, the vernacle or face of Christ for Rome, a tiny bell or a bust of Thomas Becket for Canterbury. You would buy one and sew it onto your hat or your cloak. It was your proof. It was your "I was there" t-shirt. It told the world you had completed your vow. It was a badge of honor, a symbol of your piety and your endurance. Then you would enter the cathedral itself. Inside, it was a different world, vast, cool and dim, the air thick with the scent of incense and melting wax. Light, filtered through enormous stained glass windows, painted the stone floors with jewels of color. The sound of your footsteps would echo in the immense space. Priests would be chanting at side altars, and you would join the queue, the slow-moving line of weary, hopeful people shuffling towards the shrine. The shrine itself was usually a blaze of gold, silver and precious stones, a stark contrast to the grime of your journey. And there, protected by gilded screens, was the relic, the finger bone of a saint, the skull of an apostle. You might be allowed to touch it, or to kiss the casket that contained it. You would fall to your knees. You would say your prayers, the ones you had been rehearsing in your head for hundreds of miles. You would pour out your heart, your hopes, your fears, your gratitude. You would leave a small coin as an offering, and in that moment, the entire journey, the pain, the fear, the exhaustion, it all became worthwhile. You had done it. You had reached the holy place. You had made a direct connection with the divine. It was a moment of profound spiritual climax. Of course the journey home still awaited, but you would walk with a lighter step. You carried your badge on your hat. You carried the saint's blessing in your heart. And you carried stories of the road, of the people you met, of the wonders you had seen. When you finally walked back into your own village, you were a different person. You were no longer just a baker from a small town. You were a baker who had been to Canterbury. You had seen the world. You had a direct experience of the sacred and a pewter badge to prove it. And for the rest of your life, in the quiet evenings after a long day's work, you would be the one with the best stories to tell. The procession brought the sacred into the town. The pilgrimage took the individual out of the town to find the sacred. But there was a third form of sacred spectacle, one that combined the community spirit of the procession with the storytelling of the pilgrimage. This was the great medieval tradition of the mystery play. If you couldn't read the Bible, and the vast majority of people could not, and if the priest's sermons in Latin went completely over your head, how were you supposed to learn the great stories of your faith? How could you truly understand the epic narrative that stretched from the creation of the world to the final judgment? The answer was simple. You put on a show, a very, very big show. The mystery plays, or Corpus Christi cycles, were one of the most remarkable achievements of medieval popular culture. They were vast cycles of short plays that dramatized the entire Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, and they weren't performed by professional actors in a dedicated theatre. They were performed by the ordinary people of the town, for the ordinary people of the town. It was the ultimate community theatre project, and the entire town was the stage. The driving force behind these plays was, once again, the guilds. Just as they marched in the Corpus Christi procession to show their civic and spiritual commitment, they also took responsibility for producing these plays, and the division of labour was often charmingly and logically assigned. Which guild would be best suited to stage the story of Noah's Ark, with its detailed instructions for building a giant boat? The Shipwrights Guild, of course. Who should handle the play of the Last Supper, with its focus on bread and wine? The Bakers' Guild. The story of the Magi, the three kings who brought gifts of gold, frankincense and myrrh. That was a perfect fit for the Goldsmiths' Guild. Each guild was responsible for everything related to their assigned play. They had to select the actors from among their own members. The master craftsman might play God. His apprentices might be angels. They had to create the costumes and the props. And most importantly, they had to build their stage. This was the genius of the mystery play. The pageant wagon. It was a large, heavy cart, a mobile stage on wheels. On top of this wagon, the guild would build an elaborate set for their specific scene. The shipwrights would build a beautiful multi-level ark. The butchers might build a gruesome depiction of Hell's Mouth for the play, about the harrowing of hell, often designed as a monstrous smoke-belching dragon's head, through which screaming demons would drag the souls of the damned. These wagons were a huge source of pride. Guilds would compete to see who could create the most spectacular effects, the most beautiful costumes, the most impressive wagon. On the day of the festival, these wagons would be rolled out into the town. The system was ingenious. A series of stations were designated at key points in the city, in front of the mayor's house, in the main market square, by the cathedral doors. The audience would gather at one of these stations and stay put. Then the first pageant wagon, let's say it's the Tanners Guild with the Fall of Lucifer, would be rolled into place, and the Tanners would perform their play. When they were finished, they would roll their wagon onto the next station, and the second wagon, perhaps the Drapers with the creation of Adam and Eve, would roll into its place and perform. This continued all day long. From dawn until dusk, a river of biblical history flowed through the town. If you stayed in one spot, you could see the entire story of salvation unfold before your very eyes, from the very beginning to the very end. And what a story it was! It was a remarkable blend of the deeply sacred and the delightfully profane. The plays were written in the vernacular, the everyday English of the people, not in Latin. The stories were made immediate and relatable. The actor playing God the Father might be your neighbour, the man who shoes your horse. This didn't diminish the sacredness, it domesticated it. It made God feel closer, more accessible. The tone could shift dramatically from one play to the next. The play of Abraham and Isaac, where a father is commanded by God to sacrifice his own son, would be heartbreakingly emotional, a powerful drama of faith and obedience that would leave the audience in silent awe. The crucifixion play would be brutal and graphic, designed to evoke deep pity and religious fervour. But right alongside these solemn moments, you would find broad, slapstick comedy. One of the most popular characters in many cycles was Noah's wife. In the Bible, she's barely mentioned. In the mystery plays, she was often transformed into a comic, nagging shrew who refuses to get on the ark. She argues with Noah, she gossips with her friends, she complains about the weather. The audience would roar with laughter at their domestic squabble, a scene of marital strife they recognized from their own lives, now playing out at the literal end of the world. In the play about the shepherds visiting the baby Jesus, there was often a comic subplot about a mischievous shepherd named Mac, who steals a sheep and tries to hide it in his house by pretending it's a newborn baby in a cradle. It was low comedy, pure and simple, and it existed right alongside the most profound religious mysteries. This wasn't seen as blasphemous, it was seen as human. It acknowledged that life is a mix of the sacred and the silly, the tragic and the absurd. The devils, in particular, were often a source of great entertainment. They were terrifying figures, yes, with monstrous masks and hairy costumes, but they were also clowns. They would caper about, make rude jokes, and often had firecrackers attached to their costumes that would go off with a bang and a puff of sulphurous smoke, much to the delight of the children in the crowd. They were figures of evil, but they were also figures of fun, cosmic buffoons whose plans were always destined to be foiled by God's grace. Imagine the atmosphere. The entire town has shut down for the day. It's a public holiday. Families would pack a lunch and find a good spot early in the morning. The air is filled with the shouts of vendors selling pies and ale. There's a buzz of anticipation. You're standing there in the middle of the crowd, your friends and neighbours all around you. You cheer for the angels, you gasp at the miracles, you weep for the suffering of Christ, and you boo and hiss at Herod and Pontius Pilate. When the devils appear, you laugh at their antics even as you cross yourself for protection. It was a deeply immersive, interactive experience. The stories weren't just being told to you, they were happening in your town. Adam and Eve were being expelled from a Garden of Eden that was parked right next to the fish market. The baby Jesus was being born in a stable that was, for today at least, situated just outside the Weaver's Hall. The barrier between sacred history and present reality completely dissolved. And for the guild members performing, it was the role of a lifetime. The baker who got to play Jesus would carry that honour with him all year. The apprentice who played a screeching demon would be ribbed about it for months. It was a massive undertaking that required the entire guild to work together, strengthening their bonds of community and fellowship. It was an act of worship, an act of civic duty, and a fantastic party, all rolled into one. When the last wagon, usually depicting the terrifying spectacle of the Last Judgment, finally rolled away as evening fell, the crowd would disperse, their minds filled with the grand sweep of cosmic history. They had seen it all. They had seen the creation of light, the first sin, the great flood. They had seen the birth, death, and resurrection of their Saviour. They had seen the angels and the devils. They had been reminded of the great promise of salvation and the terrible threat of damnation. The procession had shown them their place in the social order. The pilgrimage had tested their individual faith. But the mystery plays did something else. They told them the story, the one great story that gave meaning to their lives, to their work, to their suffering, to their hopes. They left the town square not just entertained, but renewed in their understanding of the very fabric of the universe. The streets would fall quiet again. The pageant wagons would be rolled back into storage sheds to be repaired and repainted for next year. The scent of incense and sulphur would fade, replaced by the familiar smell of wood smoke. The sacred spectacle was over, but the echoes remained. The image of a gilded monstrance held high, the feel of a pewter badge sewn to a hat, the sound of a neighbour's voice delivering the word of God from a wooden stage. These weren't just distractions from a hard life. They were the framework that gave that life its ultimate meaning. They were public declarations performed by and for the community, that their small lives were part of a much larger divine and eternal drama. And in a world that could often seem chaotic and cruel, that was the most comforting thought of all. The show was over, the actors had gone home, and the town could now settle into a quiet, story-filled sleep. Chapter 5. The World Turned Upside Down, Carnival, and the Lords of Misrule. But that quiet, story-filled sleep, it wasn't always the end of the tale. The neat conclusion of the morality play, where vice is punished and virtue rewarded, where the divine plan is laid bare for all to see, that wasn't always enough. Because life itself wasn't a neat and tidy play. It was messy and unfair, and full of urges and frustrations that couldn't be solved by a tidy rhyming couplet, delivered by an actor dressed as an angel. The human spirit, it seems, has always had a deep-seated need, not just for stories about order, but for moments of glorious, unadulterated chaos. The divine drama was well and good, a comforting framework for the soul, but sometimes the body needed its own festival. It needed a stage far bigger than a wooden platform in the town square. It needed the entire world for a few short, precious days to be turned completely, utterly upside down. This wasn't an act of rebellion. Not usually. It was something far more strange and far more necessary. It was a scheduled, sanctioned, and deeply understood period of madness. Think of it as a societal pressure valve. Throughout the long, cold, dark months of the year, the pressures of medieval life would build, the rigid hierarchy, the endless toil, the ever-present authority of the lord in his castle and the priest in his pulpit, the rules, the deference, the constant reminder of your small and insignificant place in the grand scheme of things. It all builds up like steam in a sealed pot, and the powers that be, the church and the secular lords, in a moment of what you might call profound psychological insight, or perhaps just pragmatic self-preservation, understood that if you don't let that steam out in a controlled way, the whole pot is likely to explode. And so, just as the winter was beginning to lose its grip, just before the long, solemn 40-day trial of Lent was set to begin with its fasting and its piety and its endless grey fish, society took a deep collective breath and plunged headfirst into madness. They called it Carnival, or in England, Shrovetide. The word itself comes from the Latin for farewell to the flesh, and they took that sentiment very, very seriously. It was a frantic, desperate, joyous last hurrah before the shutters came down. For a few days, the rules were not just bent, they were gleefully shattered. It was a time when a peasant could mock a knight, when a choir boy could preach a nonsensical sermon from the bishop's own pulpit, and when the entire social pyramid was inverted, with the fools on top and the kings at the bottom. Let's just try to imagine what that felt like. Forget the organised, ticketed and safely cordoned off festivals of today. This was something that consumed the entire community. The air, normally filled with the smell of wood smoke and damp wool and mud, would suddenly be thick with the glorious, greasy scent of roasting meat. The last of the winter stores were thrown open. It was a time for gluttony on a heroic scale. This was the origin of Shrove Tuesday, or Pancake Day, a last desperate attempt to use up all the fat, the eggs, the rich foods that would be forbidden for the next month and a half. But it was so much more than pancakes. It was a frantic feast, a defiant celebration of the body and its appetites. the soundscape of the town would transform. The usual quiet hum of work, the tolling of the church bell for prayers, was drowned out by a cacophony of shouting, of laughter, of drunken singing, of music played on rough pipes and drums. Music that was less about melody and more about a relentless foot-stomping rhythm that seemed to rise up from the very earth itself. The streets, those narrow, muddy lanes, became a river of humanity, and crucially, a river of disguised humanity. The mask was central to the entire affair. A simple piece of leather or cloth, a grotesque papier-mâché face of a demon or an animal or a fool, had the power to work a kind of magic. The moment you put on a mask, you ceased to be John the Thatcher or Mary the Spinner. You were anonymous. You were liberated from your station, from your reputation, from your debts, from your duties. You could say things you would never dare say with your own face. You could drink with people far above your station or far below it. The shy became bold, the pious became profane. The mask was a permission slip for misbehavior. It was the original What Happens in Vegas, except Vegas was your own village square, and everyone you knew was there, also wearing a pig's nose and pretending not to be themselves. This anonymity was the key that unlocked the whole festival. It allowed for the most sacred of medieval traditions to be temporarily suspended, the tradition of knowing your place. For these few days there was no place. There was only the crowd, the swirling, laughing, drinking, masked mob. A lord might find himself being jostled by a common labourer, and he couldn't take offence because who knew who was under that bird mask? A priest might hear a shockingly bawdy joke whispered in his ear by someone dressed as a goat, and he would have to just chuckle and move on. It was a great equalizer. It turned the rigid, stratified world into a kind of human soup, where all the ingredients were mixed together in one chaotic, bubbling pot. And to preside over this glorious mess, this temporary kingdom of chaos, a king was needed, but not a real king, his opposite. They called him the Lord of Misrule, the Abbot of Unreason, or the King of the Bean. His selection was often a matter of pure chance, a parody of divine right. A cake would be baked with a single bean hidden inside, and whoever found the bean in their slice was crowned king for the duration of the festival. Imagine that. 1 minute, you're a baker's apprentice, worried about getting the ovens hot enough. The next, you're biting into a piece of cake. You feel something hard, and suddenly you are being hoisted onto the shoulders of the crowd. A mock crown is placed on your head, and you are being declared the sovereign of all this madness. And your job, as Lord of Misrule, was simple: to command that which was disorderly, to decree that which was forbidden. Your sceptre was not a symbol of justice, but a pig's bladder on a stick. Your proclamations were not for the good of the realm, but for the pursuit of maximum absurdity. You might command that everyone walk backwards for an hour. You might lead a procession to the church and demand that the bells be rung out of sequence. You might hold a mock court where you put the town's most pompous merchant on trial for the crime of being too serious. Your reign was a perfect inversion of real power. It was power without consequence, authority without responsibility. It was a joke, but a profoundly important one, because in mocking the symbols of power, the crown, the sceptre, the court, it reminded everyone, including the actual rulers, that power itself was a kind of performance, that the king was just a man, and that the world could in theory be organized differently. For a few days the people got to play with the idea that they were in charge, and the Lord of Misrule was their chaotic, laughing figurehead. This spirit of inversion reached its most shocking and, to our modern minds, most bizarre expression in a ceremony known as the Feast of Fools. This wasn't just happening out in the streets. This took place inside the church itself. The very heart of order, piety and sacred mystery was turned into a stage for a holy riot. The ceremony was typically held around New Year's and was run by the junior clergy, the subdeacons, the ones at the very bottom of the ecclesiastical ladder. For this one day, they were in charge. They would elect one of their own as a boy bishop or an archbishop of fools. He would be dressed in full, magnificent vestments, often worn backwards or inside out, and would be led into the cathedral, sometimes riding a donkey right up to the high altar, in a clear and breathtakingly bold parody of Christ's entry into Jerusalem. The congregation would bray like donkeys in response to the prayers. The choir would sing obscene or nonsensical hymns. The boy bishop would deliver a sermon filled with jokes, riddles, and savage mockery of his superiors. They would burn old shoes in the censers, filling the sacred space not with the holy scent of incense, but with the stinking smoke of burning leather. They would play dice on the altar, eat sausages during the service, and generally behave in a way that would get them excommunicated on any other day of the year. It's almost impossible for us to comprehend how this was allowed. But the church authorities for a very long time tolerated it. They complained, they issued decrees trying to tone it down, but they allowed it to happen. Why? The official explanation, from a theologian at the University of Paris in the 15th century, is fascinating. He wrote, "We do these things in jest, and not in earnest, as the ancient custom is, so that once a year the foolishness that is natural to us, and is our second nature, can be got rid of." He compares it to wine barrels, which he says will burst if you don't open the bunghole now and then to let the air in. It was an admission that human beings are not angels. They are flawed, foolish, and have a capacity for chaos. And it was better to let that chaos have its own festival, to let the foolishness have its day in God's own house, in a way that was contained and understood by all as a temporary joke. By giving the madness a time and a place, you could ensure that it didn't seep into the other 360-odd days of the year. It was a way of vaccinating the community against actual uncontrolled heresy and rebellion, by injecting them with a small live dose of it under controlled conditions. Of course, the line between controlled chaos and a real riot was perilously thin, and the authorities, both church and state, watched these festivals with a nervous eye. They were always on edge. A lord of misrule, drunk on ale and temporary power, might forget that his authority was a joke. A masked crowd, feeling its collective strength, might decide that tearing down a fence or raiding a rich man's wine cellar was a better idea than just singing rude songs. The mockery of a priest could easily slide into genuine anti-clerical violence. The grumbling about an unpopular lord could, under the cover of the festival's anarchy, turn into an actual armed uprising. And it did happen. History is dotted with carnivals that got out of hand, that tipped over from licensed misrule into actual rebellion. A mock battle between factions in the town square could turn into a real one, with real weapons and real casualties. A parade could become a mob. The mask of anonymity that gave people the freedom to be foolish also gave them the freedom to be dangerous. This was the gamble the authorities took every year. They were walking a tightrope. On one side was the danger of a populace so repressed that it might explode into violent revolution. On the other side was the danger that the very festival designed to prevent that explosion might actually be the thing that lit the fuse. For the most part, the gamble paid off. The festival would run its course, the steam would be let off, and things would return to normal. But that tension, that frisson of real danger, was part of what gave Carnival its exhilarating, intoxicating power. It felt real, because in a way it was. The games played during this time were a reflection of this barely controlled violence. Forget organised sports with rulebooks and referees. Medieval festival games were more like mass brawls with a vague objective. A game that was a precursor to football might involve an entire village trying to get an inflated pig's bladder to the neighbouring village's church, by any means necessary. There were no teams, no boundaries, no rules against punching, kicking, or tackling. It was a chaotic, swirling melee that could last for hours and cover miles of countryside. There were also ritualized battles, not just with fists, but with allegorical meaning. A procession would be led by a figure representing Carnival, usually a fat, jolly man laden with sausages and wineskins. He would be met by a rival procession, led by a thin, grim figure representing Lent, carrying salted fish and prayer books. The two sides would engage in a mock battle, throwing vegetables, insults, and sometimes blows. It was street theatre on a grand scale, a public performance of the struggle that was going on inside every individual, the battle between feasting and fasting, between the body and the soul. And everyone knew that Lent, the grim-faced killjoy, was destined to win. That was the whole point. The chaos couldn't last. It was by its very nature temporary. As Shrove Tuesday wore on, a sense of frantic, almost desperate finality would fill the air. The eating and drinking would reach a fever pitch. This was the last chance for meat, the last chance for ale, the last chance for excess. Then, as evening fell, the church bells would begin to toll, and this was a different kind of bell. It wasn't the joyful, chaotic peal of the festival. It was a slow, solemn, steady clang. It was the sound of order reasserting itself. It was the death knell of misrule. In many places, this was marked by a final, somber ceremony. The figure of carnival, the fat man or an effigy, would be put on trial. He would be accused of all the sins of the past few days: gluttony, drunkenness, idleness, impiety. He would be found guilty, of course, and then he would be executed. The effigy would be burned on a bonfire, or drowned in a river, or buried in a mock funeral. The crowd, so recently his loyal subjects, would watch this performance with a strange mixture of glee and sorrow. They were killing the king, who had given them their freedom. They were burying their own foolishness, putting it in the ground for another year. It was a powerful and public act of closure. The party was officially over. The next morning, Ash Wednesday, the town would be transformed once more. The silence would be profound. The streets, littered with the detritus of the festival, would be mostly empty. The air would no longer smell of roasted meat, but of the cold, clean scent of ash and repentance. People would trudge to church, their heads aching, their stomachs uneasy, to have a cross of ash smudged on their foreheads, and be reminded of the immortal words, "Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return." The world, which had been turned upside down, had been forcefully, deliberately, and with a great sense of collective relief, turned right side up again. The Lord of Misrule was a nobody again. The boy bishop was back to being a lowly subdeacon, probably nursing a terrible headache and a fear of retribution from the real bishop. The masks were put away in a chest for another year. The social order, which had been dissolved into a chaotic soup, had solidified again, perhaps even stronger than before, because now everyone had been reminded of the alternative. They had lived for a few days in a world without rules, a world where the fool was king, and while it was exhilarating, it was also exhausting and frightening. The return to order, to the familiar comfort of knowing your place and knowing the rules, was, in its own way, a kind of relief. These festivals of misrule were not just a quirky primitive form of letting off steam, they were a deeply sophisticated, if unconscious, social mechanism. They acknowledged a fundamental truth about human nature, that we are not just rational, spiritual beings, we are also chaotic, foolish, and driven by appetite. And a healthy society, the medieval world seemed to understand, had to make room for that foolishness. It couldn't just suppress it or pretend it didn't exist. It had to be given a name, a time, and a place. It had to be invited in, crowned king for a day, celebrated, and then respectfully shown the door. It was in these moments of sanctioned chaos that the rigid structures of medieval life became, for a moment, elastic. The world was revealed not as a fixed and eternal hierarchy ordained by God, but as a construct, a performance that could, under the right circumstances, be suspended. And in that suspension, there was a strange kind of freedom. It was a freedom that allowed the society to breathe, to reset itself, before settling back into the long, hard, serious business of survival and salvation. The show was over, the Lord of Misrule had been deposed, and the whole world, tired and hungover but strangely purified, could now settle into the quiet, sober and orderly sleep of Lent. The dream of chaos was done, and the long awakening of piety had begun. Chapter 6. Milestones of Life. The rituals of baptism, marriage and death, and so the dream of chaos was done. The long awakening of piety had begun, but that communal awakening, that collective return to order after the wild release of the festival, was mirrored on a much smaller, much more intimate scale, every single day, because piety wasn't just for Lent, and the great drama of life wasn't confined to the turning of the calendar. It was a story told in 3 acts, for every single person who drew breath in this world. The great feasts marked the life of the year, but these smaller, more personal rituals marked the life of a human soul. And just like the grandest carnival, these intensely personal moments of birth, of partnership, of death, were never, ever private affairs. They were public performances, community responsibilities, played out on the village stage for all to see. The cycle of the year had reset, and now we turn to the cycle of a single life, which began not with a quiet cuddle in a maternity ward, but with a frantic, desperate race against time. Our journey into this life begins with a gasp of cold air, a cry, and an immediate, overwhelming sense of spiritual emergency. In our world, the birth of a child is a medical event followed by a social one. There are health checks and announcements, carefully curated photos and gender reveal parties. In the medieval world, the birth of a child was first and foremost a spiritual crisis. The single most terrifying thought for any parent, any family, any midwife, was that this tiny new soul might leave the world before it had been formally welcomed into God's family. The doctrine of original sin wasn't some abstract theological concept. It was a clear and present danger, a stain on the soul that had to be washed away, and fast. An unbaptized infant, it was believed, could not enter heaven. They were destined for limbo, a place of shadow, eternally separated from the light of God. And so the moments after birth were a flurry of activity, driven by a profound and urgent fear. Forget the quiet golden hour of bonding. The first order of business was baptism. If the baby was weak, or the priest was far away, there was no time to waste on a formal ceremony. The midwife, a figure of immense practical importance in the village, would perform an emergency baptism herself. We have to imagine the scene: a small, dark, smoky cottage, the mother exhausted on a straw mattress, and the midwife, her hands likely still slick with the work of birth, grabbing a cup or a bowl of water, any water would do, and hastily sprinkling it on the infant's head, reciting the crucial words, "I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." It was a stripped-down, desperate act of spiritual first aid. It was a shield thrown up against the darkness, a claim staked for this soul, declaring it for Christ before the devil could get any ideas. But if the child was strong and healthy, the full performance could be staged. And it was a performance. A few days after the birth, a small procession would form. This wasn't a private trip to the church. This was the baby's public debut. The infant, swaddled so tightly it looked like a tiny, precious loaf of bread, would be carried by its godparents. The parents themselves, especially the mother who was considered impure after childbirth and was in a period of confinement known as churching, often played a secondary role. The real stars of this opening act were the godparents. Choosing godparents was one of the most important social decisions a family could make. This was not about picking your best friend from university or your cousin who gives great birthday presents. This was medieval networking at its most foundational. Godparents, or gossips as they were called, a word that simply meant god-sibling, were forging a spiritual kinship, a bond considered as strong if not stronger than blood. You chose people who could help your child, and by extension your family. You chose someone with a bit more land, a bit more influence, a connection to a local guild, or simply a reputation for being sturdy and reliable. In a world with no social safety net, your godparents were your backup plan. They were your spiritual sponsors, your social leverage, and the people who were obligated to raise you if your parents met an untimely end. Which, let's be honest, happened with a regularity that would horrify us. So this little procession makes its way through the muddy lanes of the village to the church, but they don't go inside. Not yet. Like so many important medieval rituals, the first part of the ceremony took place at the church door, on the porch, in the public gaze. Here the priest would meet them. The godparents would speak for the child, renouncing Satan and all his works on the infant's behalf. It was a proxy war for the baby's soul, fought right there on the church steps. Then came the sensory details. The priest would anoint the baby with oil, a sign of strengthening for the coming spiritual battle. He might place a pinch of salt on the baby's tongue, the salt of wisdom, a taste of the world, but consecrated, made holy. It was also a powerful symbol of preservation and purity. And then there was the exorcism. Yes, an exorcism. For every single baby. It sounds dramatic to us, but for them it was just standard procedure. The priest would breathe on the child's face and command any evil spirit to depart, making way for the Holy Spirit to enter. It was a spiritual fumigation, clearing out any lingering demonic squatters before the new holy tenant moved in. Only after these preliminaries were complete could the party enter the church itself, moving from the profane world outside to the sacred space within. Inside, at the font, often a large stone basin near the entrance, the main event occurred, and we're not talking about a gentle trickle of water from the priest's fingertips. Early medieval baptism was about full immersion. The priest would take this tiny swaddled infant, unwrap it, and dip it 3 times into the cold, consecrated water. It's a miracle they didn't all catch their death of cold, but the symbolism was paramount. This was a death and a rebirth, The baby was dying to sin and being reborn in Christ, washed clean. You can imagine the sputtering cries, the shock of the cold, in the echoing stone church. Afterwards, the baby was anointed again, this time with holy chrism, wrapped in a special white cloth called a chrism robe, and a lit candle was placed in the godparent's hand, symbolizing the light of Christ now present in this new Christian. The child was now officially part of the flock. It had a name, a place in the parish register, and a ticket, hopefully, to the kingdom of heaven. The spiritual emergency was over, and what follows a spiritual emergency? Of course, a party. The procession would wind its way back to the family's home for the christening feast. The nature of this feast depended entirely on the family's wealth. For a poor peasant family, it might be little more than an extra loaf of bread, some cheese, and a shared jug of ale. A chance to sit down and breathe a collective sigh of relief. But for a wealthier family, a lord or a prosperous merchant, this was a major social event. It was a chance to display status, to cement the new alliance with the godparents' family, and to shower the new baby with gifts. The gifts given by godparents were significant. They weren't just sentimental trinkets. A common and very symbolic gift was an apostle spoon, a silver spoon with the figure of an apostle on the handle. For the wealthy, a complete set of 12 was a spectacular gift, a huge investment in the child's future. It was a literal silver spoon to be born with. But even for the less well-off, a gift of pewter or even wood was expected. These gifts were a tangible sign of the bond that had been forged. The feast itself would be as lavish as the family could afford, a public declaration that they had not only successfully brought a child into the world, but had also successfully navigated its treacherous spiritual entry. The community gathered, ate, drank, and celebrated the arrival of a new member. This tiny baby, who had done nothing yet but breathe and cry, had already been the star of a public drama, the subject of a strategic alliance, and the reason for a communal feast. It was a heavy burden for such small shoulders. But in the medieval world, there was no other way. You were part of the community from your first consecrated breath. And that baptized child, having successfully navigated the gauntlet of medieval childhood diseases, with a combination of luck and a sturdy constitution, would one day grow up, and as they reached adolescence, they would find themselves approaching the next great public ritual, the next communal performance of their lives, marriage. And if you think modern weddings are a source of stress and social anxiety, they are a quiet walk in the park compared to the multi-stage, legally complex, and deeply unsentimental process of getting married in the Middle Ages. The first thing we have to do is gently set aside our modern notions of romantic love. For the vast majority of people, marriage was not the culmination of a romantic journey of two souls finding each other. It was a practical, economic, and social contract. For the nobility, it was about forging alliances, consolidating land, and securing bloodlines. A wedding was a treaty, and the bride and groom were the signed, sealed, and delivered articles. For the peasantry, it was about labour and survival. A wife was a partner in the relentless toil of agricultural life. A husband was a provider and a protector. It was about creating a viable economic unit that could sustain itself, produce children to work the land, and care for you in your old age. Romance was a lovely bonus, like getting free shipping on a very expensive and legally binding purchase of a field. If it happened, wonderful. If it didn't, well, that wasn't the point of the exercise. The process began, not with a candle-lit proposal, but with a betrothal, or what was often called a hand-fasting. This was far more than just an engagement. In many cases, this was the legally binding part of the contract. It was a public declaration of intent, made in the presence of witnesses. The couple would join hands and recite vows in the present tense. I take you, John, to be my husband, and I take you, Agnes, to be my wife. These words, de presenti vows, were considered a legally binding marriage in the eyes of the church and the community. No priest was necessary. It was a verbal contract, witnessed by the community, and it was this ceremony that often involved the exchange of a ring, a symbol of the sealed pact. This public betrothal was a serious business deal. It was preceded by negotiations between the families, hammering out the details of the dowry, the wealth the bride brought to the marriage, and the dower, the portion of the husband's property she would be entitled to if he died. These were not romantic chats. They were hard-nosed financial discussions. For peasants, the dowry might be a few pots and pans, a spinning wheel, a pig, or a patch of land. For the aristocracy, it could be vast estates, chests of gold, and political influence. Everything was itemized, agreed upon, and made public. There were no secrets here. Your marriage was your neighbor's business. Once the contract was agreed upon, the next step was another piece of public theatre, the reading of the banns. For 3 consecutive Sundays, the priest would announce the upcoming wedding to the entire congregation at Mass. This was the medieval version of a public background check. It was a final call for anyone who knew of any reason why the marriage should not take place to speak up. Was one of them already betrothed to someone else? Were they too closely related by blood, or, just as importantly, by God-parenthood? The web of spiritual affinity was so complex that you could be forbidden from marrying someone because your godmother was their cousin's godmother. The reading of the banns was a crowd-sourced final check, ensuring that this new alliance wasn't going to violate some arcane rule and throw the whole community into a state of sin. Finally, the wedding day itself arrived. And again, it began with a procession. The entire village would be involved. The bride, dressed in her best clothes, which for a peasant girl was likely just her normal Sunday dress, perhaps with a few ribbons added, would be escorted from her family home to the church. She wouldn't be wearing white. That was a much later tradition. Blue, symbolizing purity, was a popular color, but really, she wore whatever her best and most colorful garment was. She would be accompanied by her family and friends, musicians playing pipes and tabors, and a group of young men, sometimes called bride knights, who acted as her ceremonial guards. This wasn't a quiet affair. It was loud, boisterous, and public. It was a parade announcing that a major change in the community's fabric was about to take place. And where did this parade end? You guessed it, at the church door. Just like a baptism, the wedding ceremony itself took place on the church porch, in the open air for all to see. Here, in front of the assembled community, the priest would ask the final formal questions about their consent and any known impediments. Here, the vows would be repeated. Here, the final exchange of the ring would happen, and the priest would bless it. The community was the primary witness. This public space was the courtroom, and the stage where the social and legal contract was finalized. This was the moment that mattered most in the eyes of the law and the village. Only after this public ceremony was concluded would the wedding party move inside the church for the nuptial mass, the specifically religious part of the celebration that blessed the union that had just been legally forged outside. And after the solemnity of the mass, what else? The feast. The wedding celebration was the biggest party a normal person was ever likely to experience in their life. Apart from the major church festivals, it was a massive communal blowout. For those with means, it was a multi-day affair with roasted meats, exotic spices and wine. But even for the poorest, the wedding feast was a crucial event, and the whole community was expected to chip in. A very common tradition was the bride ale. This was essentially a fundraising party. The bride would brew a special batch of ale, and on the wedding day, guests would pay for their drinks. The proceeds would go to the new couple to help them set up their household. It was a medieval crowdfunding campaign, a community-wide investment in the success of this new family unit. If you've ever stressed about a wedding guest list, imagine that, but every single person in your village is automatically on it, and they expect to be fed, and you're hoping they'll buy enough of your home-brewed ale to afford a new pot. The feast would be a raucous affair, with drinking, dancing, games, and probably a few fights. It was a release of tension and a celebration of community continuity. But the public nature of the wedding didn't end when the dancing stopped. One of the most alien customs to our modern sensibilities was the bedding ceremony. There was no private, romantic send-off for the honeymoon. Instead, the entire wedding party, or at least a select group of friends and relatives, would escort the bride and groom to their bedchamber. The priest might even come along to bless the marriage bed, sprinkling it with holy water to encourage fertility and ward off evil spirits. Guests would offer the couple spiced wine and food, make bawdy jokes, and generally hang around until the couple was tucked into bed. It sounds like an absolute nightmare of social awkwardness to us, but it served a vital public purpose. The consummation of the marriage was what ultimately sealed the contract, especially if property and inheritance were at stake. The community's presence was a form of witnessing, confirming that the final step in the creation of this new family had been taken. Privacy was a luxury they couldn't afford, and didn't particularly value. Your life, from your first breath to your marriage bed, was woven into the life of everyone around you, and so life, bound by these public knots of kinship and contract, would continue. The couple would become a new household, a new unit of production and procreation, contributing to the rhythm of the village. They would have children of their own, standing at the church door for a baptism, and one day stand at that same door to watch those children marry. The cycle would turn, years would pass, marked by harvests and festivals, births and marriages, until, inevitably, the final thread was cut, and the community had to gather once more for the last great public performance of a medieval life, death. Just as with birth and marriage, the medieval approach to death was profoundly public, communal, and ritualized. And just like with everything else, there was a right way and a wrong way to do it. The ideal was the ars moriendi, the art of dying. This was a death you saw coming. It was a death you could prepare for, not a sudden violent end on a battlefield, or a lonely demise from plague. A good death was a carefully staged performance with the dying person as the star. It was a final opportunity to get your spiritual house in order, and the entire community had a role to play. When a person was clearly on their deathbed, the house would fill up. This was not a quiet, private time for the immediate family. Friends, neighbours, and relatives would gather. The parish priest would be summoned. The goal was to guide the dying person through their final moments, to ensure their soul was prepared for its perilous journey. The priest would hear their final confession, a full accounting of their life's sins. This was a moment of profound psychological and spiritual release. They would be given the final sacraments, the Eucharist, known as viaticum, or food for the journey, and the anointing of the sick, or extreme unction, where their senses, eyes, ears, nose, mouth, hands, and feet, were anointed with holy oil to cleanse them of the sins committed through them. The room would be thick with the smell of incense, sweat, and sickness. The air would be filled with the low murmur of prayers. The dying person, surrounded by familiar faces, was not meant to face death alone. They were held fast by their community. They were expected to forgive anyone they had wronged, and to ask forgiveness in return. They were to renounce the temptations of the devil one last time, and put their faith entirely in Christ. It was a final public testament of faith. To die well was the last and most important duty of a good Christian, and your neighbours were there to make sure you did it properly. Once the final breath was drawn, the activity did not cease. It transformed. The women of the household or the village would take over, washing the body and wrapping it in a simple shroud of linen. The body was not whisked away to a funeral home. It stayed in the house, becoming the centerpiece of the next ritual, the wake. The medieval wake was a fascinating and complex event, a mixture of solemn vigil and slightly morbid block party. The shrouded body would be laid out on a table or a board in the main room of the house. Candles would be lit all around it, not just for light, but because the light was a powerful symbol of Christ's light, meant to ward off the demons that were believed to linger, eager to snatch the soul on its journey. The family and community would gather to sit with the body, and this vigil would often last all night, sometimes for several nights. The primary purpose was prayer. The soul was believed to be in a transitional state, heading towards its judgment. The prayers of the living were thought to be crucial, a spiritual support system to help it on its way. People would recite psalms and other prayers, a continuous comforting hum in the small, crowded room. But it wasn't all solemn prayer. Wakes were also social gatherings. Food and, more importantly, ale would be served. People would talk, share stories about the deceased, and comfort the grieving. And to our modern minds, they would play games. Games of forfeits, riddles, and even mock marriages were common at wakes. This wasn't seen as disrespectful. It was part of the process. Life, in all its noisy, messy reality, was continuing in the very presence of death. It was a way of affirming the continuity of the community, of keeping the darkness and the sorrow at bay through fellowship and activity. The wake was a final act of community care. They had guided the person out of life, and now they were guarding the body and praying for the soul, ensuring its safe passage. After the wake came the funeral procession. This was, yet again, a public spectacle, and its scale depended on the status of the deceased. The body would be placed on a simple wooden bier, or, for the wealthy, in a coffin, and carried from the home to the church. The procession was led by a cross-bearer and the priest. Family and friends would follow, and in a practice that seems strange to us, the wealthy would often hire professional mourners, poor women who would be paid to weep and wail loudly, adding to the dramatic effect and demonstrating the great sorrow felt at the person's passing. Bells were crucial. The church bells would toll, a mournful, unavoidable sound that filled the entire parish. This wasn't just to mark the sadness of the occasion. The sound of consecrated bells was believed to drive away evil spirits. Furthermore, every person who heard the bells and saw the procession was expected to stop what they were doing and say a prayer for the soul of the departed. The funeral procession was a mobile public service announcement, a community-wide call to prayer. At the church, a requiem mass would be sung. This was the formal liturgical farewell, a solemn service pleading for God's mercy on the soul. After the mass, the body would be carried out to the churchyard for burial. For most people, there would be no permanent grave marker. They were buried in the consecrated ground of the churchyard, often in just their shroud, to await the resurrection. They were physically, as well as spiritually, at the heart of their community, laid to rest in the shadow of the church where they were baptized and married. And what followed this final solemn rite? One last feast. The funeral feast was as essential as the christening or wedding feast. It was held after the burial, a way to thank everyone who had participated in the rituals. It was a somber affair, but it was also a vital part of the grieving process. It brought the community back together, moving them from the solemnity of the liturgy back into the realm of everyday life. It was a moment to share food, to share memories, and to reaffirm the bonds of the living in the face of the void left by the dead. For the wealthy, part of the funeral custom was to distribute alms, food, drink, or money to the poor of the parish, in the hope that their charitable act would win favour for the deceased soul. The funeral feast, then, was the final social act of the dead person, their last act of hospitality, a final binding of the community they were now leaving behind. But even after the body was in the ground and the last of the funeral ale had been drunk, the community's obligation was not over. In medieval belief, most souls did not go straight to heaven or hell. They went to purgatory, a place of purification where they would suffer for a time to cleanse themselves of their remaining sins. The duration of this stay in purgatory, it was believed, could be shortened by the prayers and good works of the living, and so the dead remained a part of the community's consciousness. Families would pay for priests to say masses for their dead, sometimes for years. Wealthy individuals would endow chantries, chapels where a priest was employed to do nothing but say mass for their soul in perpetuity. For ordinary people, remembrance was woven into the church calendar. All Souls' Day on November 2nd was a time for the entire community to pray for all the faithful departed, to visit their graves, and to leave offerings of soul cakes. The dead were not gone. They were just in another place, a place from which they still needed the help of their community. We worry about our digital footprint. They worried about their soul's footprint, the impression they left in the memory and the prayer life of their village. Your existence didn't end with your last breath. It ended when the last person who knew you, or was paid to remember you, said their final prayer for your soul, and so the cycle of life closed. A journey that began with a communal panic to save a soul from limbo, that was sealed with a communal contract at the church door, ended with a communal effort to speed that same soul through purgatory. Every step, from the first cry to the final silence, was a public event. Your life was not your own. It belonged to your family, to your village, to your God. And in a world so full of hardship and uncertainty, perhaps there was a strange and powerful comfort in that. A comfort in knowing that you would never, ever have to face the great milestones of your life or your death entirely alone. You were held, from beginning to end, in the sturdy, ever-present, and inescapable embrace of the community. And now, held in the quiet of your own room, you too can let go and ease into the simple, private, and blessed ritual of sleep. The performance is over. The story is told. Rest now,